I'm Peter King, CBS News. To many, Mount Dora, northwest of Orlando, is a destination for antiquing restaurants and a taste of old Florida. But its past and that of surrounding Lake County includes lynchings, murders, rigged trials, and other examples of racism and corruption. This weekend, a statue of the journalist who exposed the wrongdoing in the 50s and 60s is being unveiled in the town she was forced to leave. Gilbert King has written extensively about Mabel Norris Reese in his books Beneath a Ruthless Sun and the Pulitzer Prize-winning Devil in the Grove. What was her wake-up call? What finally got her to understand that what was going on wasn't what it seemed to be?
She had sort of this idyllic view of Florida through the lens of the local law enforcement, Sheriff Willis McCall, and their prosecutor friend, Jesse Hunter. I think the wake-up call for her was really when the Groveland boys were shot on the side of the road. And the prosecutor, Jesse Hunter, called her and said, I think he murdered them. He didn't think it was self-defense. And I think it was that point on that Mabel Norris Reese really took a hard look at some of the writing that she'd been doing, sort of giving McCall's version of everything instead of bringing her independence and her journalistic abilities to Lake County.
Specifically, what were some of the things she wrote about in exposing what was going on there?
Well, I think when she started out, she was covering the trial from more like the prosecutor's perspective. But then after the shooting, what happened next was they went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court didn't call her out by name, but was basically talking about her when they said a lot of the press was biased in Lake County. It would have biased and destroyed the jury pool, and that there was no way they could have a fair environment. And I think she took that really personally. And so after that, she started writing about Willis McCall actually being much more heavily involved in some of the racism and the law breaking that was happening in Lake County. And she started taking a much more critical eye at the trial and at the innocence of the Groveland boys.
We are going back more than 70 years for the rape that the Groveland boys were accused of wrongly. This is, of course, long before the internet. It's in the infancy of television, if you will. How widespread were her stories read as the 50s went on?
They were really relegated to a certain part of Lake County, which was in Mount Dora. But eventually what had happened with Mabel was she basically was run out of Lake County. Willis McCall and his friends put together a rival newspaper in Mount Dora, and Willis McCall went around basically warning all of Mabel's advertisers not to take out any more ads in Mabel's paper, and that ruined her. And she really could not support the newspaper anymore with McCall as her enemy, and so she was forced to move over to Daytona Beach. And when she moved to Daytona Beach, well, she got a job with the Daytona Beach News Journal as a columnist and reporter, and then she gained a much wider audience there, and she began to write stories that were seen all around the state, and she was still focusing on Willis McCall.
And there were all kinds of threats made against her, and it was a very, very scary time for her.
She had a cross burned in her yard. She had 2 bombs thrown at her house. Some Klansmen poisoned her dog with steak that was laced with strychnine. And like I said, her offices were defaced and vandalized. But it wasn't until they just basically ruined her by opening a rival white supremacist newspaper. And that was just the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, and she had to just leave Lake County.
As the 50s and 60s went on, what happened with her? What happened with her career?
Well, I think, her experiences in Lake County standing up to white supremacists and the Klan was really something that came in quite handy for her, because being in Daytona Beach, she was closer to St. Augustine. And once 1960s rolled around, there was a great moment in the summer of 1964 where St. Augustine was really on the world stage as far as civil rights go. There was all of these protests. Martin Luther King came down. There was violence in the streets every night. It was playing out on the news every night. And Mabel was right in there covering it. She was, talking to the Klansmen, talking to Martin Luther King, interviewing Martin Luther King about these stories. And by then, she was a hardened reporter who had experienced this. And so she really brought a lot to the table to cover civil rights in the 1960s, right at the time of the signing of the Civil Rights Act.
What are the takeaways and the lessons for today's readers who are perhaps reading your books or listening to this and hearing about the sculpture and Mabel for the first time?
Well, I think in these times we're sort of returning to an era where, journalism isn't really trusted. You hear a lot of things about fake news and enemy of the people, and the reporters have a very difficult job to do in this day and age, standing up to these false narratives that get out there, and so I think what's really important is to recognize that. Maybe being called out on Twitter is not quite as severe as having bombs thrown at your house, having your office vandalized and destroyed, having crosses burned in yards. So I think the takeaway is look at what Mabel had to endure. She had threats on her life constantly while she was doing this kind of reporting. And so I think it's a great message to journalists today that, yes, it might be a difficult time for journalists, but maybe our lives aren't quite threatened here in the United States quite as much. And so we should have a great respect for people who are willing to stand up to power and hold truth to power.
That's Gilbert King, the author of Beneath a Ruthless Sun and the Pulitzer Prize-winning Devil in the Grove, talking about journalist Mabel Norris Reese. And I'm Peter King, CBS News Orlando.